Welcome to another episode of Courageous Healing. I am your producer and co-host, Victor Escalante. And before we get started, we want to give a big shout out to Roy Haston, the composer of our opening music. He's really quite talented, and you can go to the show notes. If you need original compositions, be sure and contact him for him to see what he can do for you. Joining me in the studio, as is customary, is Adele George. Adele, welcome to another episode. The month is almost over for Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
I know, and I'm happy to be here. I'm glad that we're still talking about this, and I'm glad that people are taking the time, and I want to thank everybody who's taken the time to listen to us so far. We'd love to have some comments and input, or if you would love to be a guest on the show, we would love to have you.
Absolutely. And just a heads up, listeners, we have in talking to a psychotherapist, she's agreed to join us for the podcast. So we will be bringing you a great interview for you to hear firsthand from a therapist's perspective, what she is going through in working with victims of domestic violence. So Adele, tell us what we're going to talk about today.
Today, I want to talk about the power and control wheel of abuse. It's an illustration, and we'll put up a link so that you can see like a copy of what this looks like. And this power and control wheel of abuse identifies 8 different characteristics of power and control that someone can try to take over another person. And it's physical violence, sexual violence, any type of violence like that, as well as a whole bunch of other things, which we'll get into the details. And then to counteract that, there's also a wheel of nonviolence. And that takes it and explains the opposite of what the characteristics of violence are. So today, I thought it would be a good idea to at least start talking and going through the wheel. We might end up with a part 2 on this one, but we're going to start talking about each one of those topics and what they look like. And then what the opposite of that or the nonviolence of that could be. And, and Victor, I'm going to look to you to maybe give us some advice on, from a trauma healing perspective of how you can move through these things as well. So, we're going to go ahead and get started. And the first one is the use of intimidation. And so this one says, we're using the term her, but please understand that it's only in a generic reference. We know that a domestic violence happens to everyone. So making her afraid by looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying her property, abusing pets, and displaying weapons. So using intimidation is something that is usually at the beginning of before someone starts to exhibit extreme violence. So I think with this one, for me in particular, it was something my ex-husband used to use a very commanding voice when he would talk to me, when he would get abusive. Now, while he didn't smash things, it is common, because it's at this point in the intimidation that a temper also shows up.
Okay. And again, this is these are the subtle start of the abuse that, of course, is going to escalate into more and more and greater abuse. But these are subtle things, well, maybe not so subtle, the destroying things and causing fear. I was talking with a victim recently, Adele, that she is now going through divorce and separated from a very abusive, controlling, narcissistic man, that he has some of the traits in talking to her of being a psychopath. Mm-hmm. Now, so Adele, how much do you know about psychopaths? Because I'd like to interject this element into our discussion, because it's salient to what we're talking about even though there's clear distinctions, I want you to begin to understand the difference. And I'm going somewhere with this point because he was doing psychological, mental intimidation with some of the tactics that he's been using on his wife. So tell me what you know about psychopaths.
Don't really know a whole lot about psychopaths because my ex-husband was schizophrenic. So
Okay.
me, that was more of what I dealt with.
Okay.
Which was larger than life, could believe.
Let's go there. Let's go there about being in a marriage or relationship with someone that has schizophrenia. So Adele, and I'll go, listeners, I'll go into the psychopaths after we cover this particular point. Was your ex-husband Chad? Was he ever diagnosed with organic schizophrenia, or was this an environmental thing, diagnosis from his experience, from his trauma?
I believe it was from his trauma where he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia.
Okay.
And, it was my understanding, and when talking to my therapist, when she was assisting me in understanding, like what all of this was and this diagnosis was, he really truly believes that he can be whatever he wanted to be. And that he really truly believed that whatever he thought of and he could do. There was
Okay.
never any sort of what's the word I'm looking, any sort of restriction or any sort of
They don't have any limits. They don't have any
no,
filters.
they don't have the voice of reason.
Yes, exactly.
So
You cannot
no,
reason. You cannot reason with them. If you use logic, it's not going to work. All you can do, all you can do is try to de-escalate anytime that they're in that mode to protect yourself, one, but at times to protect them also if you have the capacity. But understand this, listeners, it is not up to you to be the caregiver of an abuser. They have to seek professional help on their own, because I've seen a lot of victims, Adele. I don't know what your experience is, but they were worried more about their abuser than they were about themselves. And at some point, you gotta put yourself first.
you definitely have to put yourself first. You're absolutely right about that. One of the things, though, that I do want to point out that was told to me is that there are medications,
That's
for
correct.
schizophrenia, and there are things that can help. You just have to get the person, and it's not, again, it's not your responsibility. If the person is being abusive and erratic, it's not your responsibility to see to it that this person gets help. This person has to get help on their own. However, it is possible that this person with the right cocktail of medications can function on a normal level in society. It's just that it depends on how far they are. It depends on so many different things as far as that's concerned. But regardless, you do not focus, especially for someone who has that sort of an extreme mental disorder.
Yes,
The likelihood of just being able to go into family counseling is going to be slim to none.
that's correct.
Or just going into general family counseling, if you go into it, it's not going to be effective
Yes,
because that's not the type of counseling that they need. It might be what you need, but that's not what they need. So, and you'll
correct.
find it out really quick.
That's correct. So listeners, let me expound on what Adele just said, because I lived through this firsthand, because my first wife was diagnosed as a schizophrenic and bipolar victim of domestic violence at home when she was a little girl growing up, at the hands of her father, who was a minister and an alcoholic. And every time that he would get drunk, he would physically beat the wife, drag her by the hair around the house with four screaming girls.
Mm-hmm.
And so when my ex-wife started to grow up, she started to defend the mom. And so of course she became the brunt of the physical abuse. And back then, if we didn't have the laws in Texas in place, that he would leave her with welts on her back from the beatings that he gave her as a little girl. But today, if he would do, anyone does that, you are automatically convicted of child abuse. But back then, the statutes were not in place. And of course, because it was in the church, it was never reported because the church was concerned about bad press. The church knew about it, but they withheld it from the congregation, again, because of this getting out into the community. Imagine. So this was one of those situations also, that she was not born schizophrenic. It was the conditioning. It was the nature where she grew up that created that schism. What I mean by that is the person ends up compartmentalizing their feelings so that they don't completely go crazy. I mean, it's they are in a crazy environment, right? Which father that is a preacher on Sunday and at night gets drunk and beats his children and his wife, and traumatizes the entire family, and then the next day when he's sober tells them that he loves them, and goes way overboard to try to give them anything they want, to try to appease them, okay, to try to ameliorate the trauma. So imagine this, Adele, day in and day out, day in and day out, or week in and week out, growing up. Imagine what kind of personality that person is going to be like. Now, I did, when we were dating, there was no signs. I didn't see any signs. The family never told me anything, just like in your case. Your family didn't know how to prepare you. And your close friends knew of Chad's erratic behavior, but they kept it quiet. They never told you or warned you anything about it. So what happened, listeners, in my case is my ex-wife ended up, she was very allergic to poison ivy. And she brushed up against the poison ivy. It irritated her skin so much that I had to take her to the doctor. The doctor prescribed steroids. Okay, the steroids is what pushed her over the edge because she was malnourished. I didn't know that she was hiding behind my back, that she was not eating properly, because on top of that, she was also showing signs of being bulimic, trying to vomit everything she ate because she became obsessed with her physique. Again, these are patterns that when you don't know what's going on, you're terrified when something. And I was looking back, I was extremely terrified because the attending psychiatrist told me that she may be like this, heavily medicated, like a zombie, in the hospital, that she may be like this for life. Okay. I went through 5 different psychiatrists because I knew there had to be more than what they were telling me, or I was just not willing to accept one psychiatrist's opinion as being the gospel truth. And so, make a long story short, eventually I was able to find the right psychiatrist that prescribed the right cocktail of medications. In those days, we didn't have the broad range of designer drugs that we have today. I'm talking back then, we only had, and maybe this will ring a bell, Adele, we had Thorazine, we had Mellaril, that the medication was almost as bad as the illness because of the side effects that it had. That back then, people who suffer from schizophrenia, they would rather not take the medication because of the awful secondary effects that it gave them. So listeners, I have lived through this myself firsthand also. And this is what encouraged me to go down the psychology path to try to study to understand what I was dealing with. And then I got so fascinated by how the mind works that I just continued with my studies. And sadly, like you mentioned, Adele, she refused to go get professional help. Therapists cannot work on their own family members because you cannot be objective. And so when I asked her to get professional help, she flat out refused, and I reached the point where I knew there was no hope. I don't know about you, Adele, but in my case, the breaking point was one day after 15 years of going through this, I realized that I had a right to be happy. Prior to that, it was my religious belief, married till until death departs. I was no longer willing to do that. I accepted it, but I reached the point that that's no longer true for me. I wasn't willing to live like that. And again, we all have our stories as to what causes us to stay in an abusive relationship. And that was my story. Is for 15 years I tolerated fits of rage that were uncontrollable. I'm talking about if she would go into a fit of rage, the first week that we were married, Adele, she got very angry and went into a fit of rage. She was basically a rageaholic that she tore up all of our wedding pictures. Again, this is irrational. You cannot explain this. How does tearing up all of our wedding pictures change anything?
And that's a use of intimidation.
Exactly.
The use of intimidation.
She would cut up my ties in fits of rage. And so this is the crazy making and the crazy that you live with someone who has schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
Right. And, and that's something that we're not going to really get into today is, mental health care, because that's a whole topic on it.
That's a whole different topic for a whole nother
That's a whole different topic on its own. But the thing is it's really hard when someone who has these level of mental disorders, they believe they're okay.
Yes.
Because they don't see the world through the same lenses that we do as people who, what I would consider, we all have our mental health issues, but we have our feet planted on the ground, and we do see the world around us in a clearer vision. So for this one, just to take it full circle, because I know you want to talk about the other mental health issue, but to take it full circle, when you go into the cycle, and the opposite of this for nonviolence is a non-threatening behavior. The person is going to talk and act as though they feel safe and comfortable expressing themselves and doing things. So with this, just know that if someone is using intimidation, it's not a healthy pattern, and you really want someone with a non-threatening behavior.
Yes. So Adele, what is the non-threatening behavior?
A non-threatening behavior is just feeling safe. You're going to feel safe with someone, and that person is not going to react and smash things and abuse pets and try to use some sort of, like, if you have guns at home because the person likes to hunt, or just because they like to collect guns and they like to go shoot, it's a hobby. There's nothing wrong with that. But when a person uses a weapon as a form of intimidation, that's where the problem is. It's the opposite of harming someone. So you're basically looking at someone that you can talk to that's going to make you feel comfortable in their presence.
Yes. What would you recommend to say someone that again has guns in the home? He's an abuser and he suffers from schizophrenia. What would be your recommendation?
One of the things that I would do is check the laws in your state.
Yes.
Some states at this point have laws where if you if someone gets arrested for domestic violence, then the weapons get confiscated, because it's I forget what the statistic is, but most women die by gunfire from a partner. Most female murders happen by a gun, and they happen with an abusive partner. So with that being said, they will confiscate the weapons. If they don't, or you don't have a law like that on the books in your um town, in your state, I would definitely look at, a way to start removing yourself from that relationship.
Yes.
Sooner rather than later. But
Interesting fact, Adele. I was doing another show interviewing the executive director of the Bridge Over Troubled Waters, which is a shelter for women and children here in Houston. And she brought up this statistic that the chances of victims being murdered, if it's not done with safety, increases up to 700%. Imagine that, Adele.
It's insanity.
That is insanity. So you need to be very careful. As Adele mentioned previously, you need to have a plan. You need to have a well thought out plan. And if you missed that discussion, it's in our previous episodes of what you need to do if your life is in danger, how you need to prepare an exit plan. Let's move on, Adele, to the point that I started out, that I veered off, that I want to circle back to: a psychopath. A psychopath is something that I discovered when I was going to school, that our instructor said they are born with a brain that they lack the neural connections. Think of it as wiring. They lack the wiring to have empathy. They have no empathy. They don't know what empathy is like. And so they are cold, premeditated, and they execute their intentions without any regard for their mate, their spouse or wife, their husband. And so that's the distinction of a psychopath, is that they have no remorse whatsoever because they're missing the mechanisms in the brain, the neural connections, in order to have empathy that would, in theory, you would think would stop them. So there are some people out there that's the extreme. Normally, you don't see this. Now, I also think, listeners, and I'm going to do a little bit of research and put some links in the show notes, that there are gradients of a psychopath, because there are some. What comes to mind, Adele, is there was a brain researcher that gave a TED talk that he was looking at brain scans of psychopaths. I think he was doing research work in the prison system. And so he was scanning brains. And again, you're able to see the density of certain parts of the brain. And what was interesting is he took a scan of his brain and he was a psychopath. Turns out that he was a psychopath. I don't know if you ever heard of that TED Talk, or you seen it?
No, I haven't.
Very interesting. And I'll put a link in the show notes also for listeners to check it out. That was fascinating because, again, while he's not a calculated cold murderer, he just lacked that part of that neurology in his brain to be able to have the level of empathy and compassion that the average person on the street would have. Okay?
I just did a quick Google of, what is a psychopath? Just because, like I told you at the beginning, I didn't know what it was.
Sure.
And one of the things that I find that's interesting is that they have superficial charm and they're manipulative.
They're extremely charming, again, because this is the knack that they put on. Okay? You're listening to Courageous Healing Podcast. We'll be right back.
Looking for the perfect soundtrack to bring your project to life? Meet Roy D. Haston, an experienced composer who creates captivating music for films, commercials, and live events. From emotional scores to upbeat, energetic tracks, Roy's compositions add depth and emotion to every story. His unique soundscapes elevate your project and leave a lasting impression. Visit roydhaston.com and discover how Roy's music can transform your next project into something unforgettable. And thank you, Roy, for your original music for our Courageous Healing podcast.
We now return you to the Courageous Healing podcast. They know how to play the act, and they act out so charming and so sensitive, so attentive. But this is just an act to lure you in.
Yep. So it says they have a lack of empathy.
Yes.
They have superficial charm. They're manipulative.
Extremely manipulative.
Impulsive.
Yes.
And then they have a lack of remorse, and they often have a sense of grandiosity.
Yes. Does that sound like Chad?
Totally. Maybe he was misdiagnosed.
Yeah. You never know.
Yeah. But I mean, because the thing is that it's, this is the twist in this. And this is the twist. And even in the using intimidation and the power, this whole wheel, the twist in all of this is that what happens is you end up falling for a person that has all of these characteristics of a psychopath or, a schizophrenic person or a bipolar person, where you end up getting in a relationship with them and then realizing there's no substance to what backs up what they're saying. And and then when the curtain gets pulled, or when they think the curtain gets pulled, is when the violence starts to happen.
Yes.
It's when, because the cracks start to show, and they have to continue to keep this all together, which was one of the things with Chad, was that it was very important to him that his reputation was completely polished.
Plus, he worked in law enforcement. He got out, then he would lose his job because again, the sheriff's department that he was a sheriff's deputy at would not tolerate that.
But he also wanted to be the best of the best.
Yes. Putting on airs. The perfect human being.
Yes. So he can charm anybody. Everybody who met him adored him. Yeah. So this is where we as women, and as men as well, when we get into these relationships, or we start to begin relationships, and especially for people like us who have been through this type of stuff, it's a little bit of a sketchy navigation in order to because you don't want to come off as judging somebody that, oh, they're going to abuse me too. But then you don't want these false red flags to go off either. Yeah. So it's very important that when you do get into a relationship with someone, that you do communicate these things. You do talk about what you've been through, and you don't have to do this in the first date, but if it's going down a serious path, then talk to them and tell them what you've been through, and then start as soon as you can, as soon as comfortable, to introduce them to your friends. Yeah. Maybe not your family, but get some other people to
get opinion. You're under the influence of oxytocin. Right. You're not going to be the most objective.
Right. And so get them around your friends, get them to hang out, in that type of thing. Maybe not your family, but at least some really close friends, so that some friends can kind of, hang out with them. And I'm not talking to bring around your friends and let them grill them. It's not the point. Yeah. It's just introducing them.
No, friends will get a vibe.
Yeah. Look, I trust my friends implicitly, and I trust your opinions. And so if you're not sure, bring somebody else in. And another thing too, and I'll say this, even though I don't want to get into the mental health conversation, mental health today is a wonderful trend. It's
Yeah.
trendy and it's trending. And so I am seeing more and more newer couples going into that know that they want to have a long-term relationship, going into some sort of couples therapy, group therapy, couples therapy type of situations. A lot of these kinds of programs are done through like churches,
Yeah.
but I've seen these programs where, within 6 to 8 months, they just start going to therapy because they want to continue to have a healthy relationship and they want to grow the relationship. So it's not waiting until things get terribly bad either.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, awareness goes a long ways, and especially in the setting of a faith-based organization, a church, support group, uh, whatever it is,
right.
the awareness is going to be very good.
Yeah.
Well, we got one one point on the violence wheel. Adele,
Okay.
what's another one?
The next one is using emotional abuse. Putting
Okay.
her down, calling her names, making her think she's crazy, playing mind games, humiliating her, making her feel bad about herself, and making her feel guilty. So emotional abuse is okay. Physical abuse is horrible. No one should ever be subjected to anything that obviously physically causes damage. Emotional abuse is a mind fuck.
Yes.
And what happens is you don't know yourself from a hole in the wall. Because if you have at any point in your life been treated or raised to believe that you're less than, this will make you take a complete nosedive. So it's like, they're putting you down. They're telling you you're not worthy. They're telling you that you can't do stuff right. They're telling you that, you can't satisfy them in bed. They'll call you a bitch. She'll call you, I mean, look, when we're all clowning around, we'll call each other asshole and bitch. But if somebody's actually calling you these names and they actually have some oomph behind it, they mean it.
Yes.
So, and that's disrespectful and it's not a loving thing to do.
So let me close the circle on the psychopath where my mind took me with this particular woman that I was speaking with.
Right?
She said there was some sort of local case here in Houston of some guy that had murdered his wife. It was all in the news. I didn't know who the case was about. But anyway, on the anniversary date when they separated, Adele, when he was asked by the judge to leave the house that they shared, he sent a box wrapped as a gift with like numbers. Like basically, if you opened up the box and you looked at the contents inside, it was the numbers of the date of the anniversary when you had to move out. Okay. And so again, this was extremely terrifying to her because again, the subtle message is, I'm going to kill you and I'm going to get away with it.
Right.
She got the message, but it was coded because the criminal justice system is not set up to decode that kind of aggression. And so there's a lot of deficits in the criminal justice system to be able to really restrain abusers. Now, she's a police officer and head of the organization here in Houston that answers calls to domestic violence. And I was encouraged to hear her testimony that now they go in pairs, and one of the officers is trained in mental health to distinguish the subtlety and the unspoken coded messages that the victim may be giving them when they answer the call. For example, if the victim is the only one that comes to the door, the officer may put up their hand, and ask the victim, how many fingers am I holding up? So if it's 4 and she says 5, that's a code for, okay, we need to investigate. We need to go inside, or we need you to step outside. And again, they're there to de-escalate the primary role is not to arrest, but to do a thorough assessment to see if there's any danger here that we need to take away the victim and put her in a shelter or some other facility.
Well, and not to actually dive into political, because we're saying the only time we're talking about politics here, just to be clear, guys, is when we're talking about laws. However, one of the things that has been a really big topic of conversation over the past years is having social workers on a part of law enforcement, where because they are specifically trained in this de-escalations.
Yes.
They are specifically trained in picking up and listening to what is and really understanding what's going on in a situation, especially those that work in crisis mode,
Yes.
in crisis situations. So I'm a huge advocate for seeing more social workers become part of, law enforcement to some capacity in that particular situation, because de-escalation is a challenge.
Yes,
It's a
absolutely.
challenge. And so you have to have knowledge, and you have to be able to, because if they're dealing with a psychopath, they need to know how to handle that psychopath.
Yeah, because he's going to use, he knows how to game the system. He or she knows how to game the system to where they speak in code or they do things to where they're not held accountable.
Right.
I was also encouraged because I also asked this particular officer is what is happening in the judicial system? Because what happens when you go to court in front of a judge? She says, we testify, we're brought in, we're subpoenaed, and we testify on the nuance of the case that, again, the average prosecutor may not know the proper questions to ask so that, again, justice is served.
Right. Well, the opposite of this is actually a wonderful thing. It's respect. It's listening to her it's listening to her without judgment. It's being emotionally affirming and understanding and valuing opinions. So there's a really distinct difference between using emotional abuse and being respectful of of your partner. And if you have a respectful partner, and you have a partner that doesn't exhibit that exhibits non-threatening behavior, and you have a friend that is in a relationship that doesn't look like that looks more like they're getting some sort of abuse, use your relationship as a comparison. Use your relationship to say, look, my husband, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, my significant other respects me.
Excellent point. Because again, some victims don't know what the proper behavior is, the proper treatment, because that's all they know is abuse.
Right. Exactly. And exactly.
Especially if they come from being raised in an abusive home to where that was the norm.
Yep. Because, and then, because they say that as well. I mean, there are women and men out there who repeat the cycle of abuse. They leave an abusive relationship and go into the next one because it's what they know and it's what they fall for. And it's because they haven't gotten the help that they need in order to be very clear about, themselves and their self-worth and their value. And that's the one thing in the respect column also, is that you respect yourself. I'm going to add that to that little slot, because when you respect yourself, you're going to know that you're being put through something that is inappropriate. You're going to have some worth. You're going to have some self-value. You're going to have these things to go, whoa, wait, this is not how I want to be treated. And you're going to know that you have a choice to be treated better.
That's
you
correct.
Can make that choice to leave the relationship. Now, again, we know that that's not always easy. That's not what we're trying to say, but you have a choice, and you can make the choice to leave. Then you have to make the plan, depending on where you're at in this relationship.
Absolutely. What's another one, Adele?
All right. So the next one is using isolation. Controlling what she does, who she sees and talks to, what she reads, where she goes, limiting or outside involvement, using jealousy to justify actions. This one is very, very, very sneaky. It's not something that jealousy by itself, I think we all have some sort of innate jealousy when it comes to things.
Sure.
So if
The emotional mechanism for that, Adele, because I did a whole show on jealousy, is what the research shows is that the person feels that the person is giving someone else something that only belongs to them. Okay.
Right.
Again, and it's extreme. It's like, how dare you? How dare you flirt with someone? Why don't you flirt with me? How dare you look at somebody when you don't look at me? It's like, again, they become extremely possessive. And you went through some of this with Chad, Adele, to where you were his property. So talk about that.
Right. So there's two sides to jealousy that I do want to say. One is that jealousy can just simply mean that someone has a lack of confidence. And it could just simply be that, they're like, if I was in a relationship with someone and then the three of us were having dinner and you and I were having a great time talking and they felt left out, that potentially lead to some jealousy because they feel like they're not a part of what it is of our friendship.
Yeah.
However, jealousy when it comes to abuse is a whole different ballgame, because when what happens is they use it as they weaponize it. So for me, for instance, I'm the type of person where I'm going to make friends with my partner's friends. And I had one of his friends and we had some things in common. So we sat down one night and while my ex-husband was doing something around the house and he and I were watching a movie and we were talking about this stuff and we were really intent in this conversation. And he literally the next day, we stopped hanging out with him. Like he said, he's not coming over anymore. I don't want you around him. And the reason was because he was afraid that I was bonding with him. And that it was going to become a relationship of some sort, or that something that he was going to be able to bring something better than what let me rephrase that. He was afraid that his friend was going to be better than he was.
Yes.
So
he had to be the best. He had to, there was no one that could compete with him, and he was going to make sure that nobody competed with him.
Right. And so the jealousy was, for him, it's fear-based.
Sure.
It's intimidation-based and it's fear-based. And so then all of a sudden I became isolated from him. And I pretty much never saw him again. And, the other thing about controlling what a person does, that's really insidious. Because the thing is that it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't go to the grocery store and Walmart and that you can't do some of the things. What it means is, like, when you want to get together with your friends and you want to go do something with your friends, you're going to start doing less and less of that because you're going to have the space, and you're not going to have the space and time, or they're going to manipulate you into wanting to just be with them. So if you're like, oh, Sarah called me and she wants to have a girls' night with me and a couple of other girls, and he's going to come back and say, oh, you know what? Well, I was thinking about taking you to the movies and dinner on Friday night.
Yeah.
So
subtle manipulation of
manipulation. No. Yeah. Because he doesn't want you to, he or she or whomever doesn't want you to have the chance to be influenced by other people.
Yeah. So listeners, listen to my personal experience of how crazy this is. So my schizophrenic ex-wife, she began to isolate me from my own family, my mother, because she didn't want me talking to her. She didn't want me going over and visit my family. So I became estranged from my family to some extent. Although I put my foot down on special occasions and at times, in time, I just wanted to avoid a conflict, and I began to isolate myself from my family. And the other thing, again, another experience that comes to mind is I bought her a brand new watch for her birthday, and we go see one of the old James Bond movies, which Adele, back in those days, they were they were very tame compared to the movies of today. I'm talking around 83, 84. Okay. So we went to a James Bond movie, and because there was a thinly dressed actress on the screen, she orders me to look down. Okay. She didn't want me to look at the screen. A James Bond movie. I was not allowed to look at the screen. And because I refused, she takes her brand new watch and slams it into the concrete. And of course, the watch just shatters to pieces. Again, it's uncontrollable rage that they go into that has no rhyme or reason, no logic whatsoever. And you just begin to accept that, well, that's just the way they are.
Yeah. And the opposite of that is really, truly endearing. It's trust and support.
Sure.
Your partner is just going to support your goals in life in general, and know that you can go and have a girls' night, and you're going to be safe, and you're going to have a good time, and that you have a right to your own feelings and friends and activities and opinions and things, where it's you're not you're an individual. You're not being held back.
So listeners, we're giving you the abnormal and the normal. If you are experiencing a lot of abnormal, you are a victim of domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll take us to the next one, and we'll have to leave it there because we got more to do in the next episode.
Yep.
What's the next one?
Part 2.
Yes.
So this one is definitely really interesting to me. It's minimizing, denying, and blaming. It's making light of the abuse. It's not taking our concerns about it seriously, saying the abuse didn't happen, shifting responsibility for abusive behavior and saying she caused it. So most people nowadays, there's a really trendy term that everybody's using right now, and it's called narcissism. And I suggest that when you do that, before you use it, that you really become familiar with what exactly is what exactly is a narcissist. And because, just like it's thrown around in ways, it's thrown around a bit too much. And, I want to be clear that just because someone is protective of their own self doesn't make them a narcissist. However, in this particular instance, they're what they're trying to do is get you to think differently, to get you, convince you that, oh, you're over it, you're this is no, you're not seeing this the way it should be seen. I didn't do that. I wasn't that mean. I wasn't that way. I think you're taking this too far, that type of thing. So I find that with this one, it's basically like the narcissistic person with a gullible person. And they're able to be convinced that, or they're attempting to be convinced that it's not that big of a deal. I don't know what you're talking about because it's not that big of a deal. Or
gaslighting the victim, blaming them for the wrong conclusion.
Yeah. And I use the example that I like to use for gaslighting is that if you're standing outside and you're looking up at the sky and the sky is clearly blue and someone is literally trying to tell you that the sky is orange or that the sky is green. They're literally saying, you don't see it. You don't see it. I can't believe you don't see it. It's green. It's green. They're trying to convince you of something that's not real. So, but this is something that, again, on all of these, I'm thinking on this power and control wheel are very, very, very insidious. So you don't necessarily notice them at first, but if you're in a position where you're trying to have a conversation with your partner and you're like, I don't like the way that you're treating me through X, Y, and Z, then please take some time to listen to how they come back to you And if my ex-husband just completely would turn the tables on me. I would say, I don't like the way that you're treating me. I don't like the way that you're doing this. And he would literally turn the table, spin it back around, and make me look at myself and say, well, that's because you're not being good. You're not a good wife, or you're not a good cook, or you're not a good this, or you're not worthy, or, you just aren't the one you're the problem, not me. And that happens pretty frequently. So, the opposite of that is honesty and accountability. Accountability is a hard thing. Honesty usually can come by pretty easy, but it's accepting responsibility for self, acknowledging past use of violence, admitting being wrong, and communicating openly and truthfully. Accountability is everything. And if a person is willing to take accountability and responsibility for their behaviors, then, you can work through the problem. But if they're not willing to take accountability, you definitely need to sit down and take a hard look and start to question things a little bit more, because accountability is hard.
Very hard. Yes. Taking ownership and saying, I made a mistake. I'm sorry.
And a lot of people just don't. And accountability to me is the big one, because honesty is big too. Don't get me wrong. You have to be honest. But if your partner is not going to go, yeah, that was my fault, or I did something wrong.
Yes.
Or, now I see what you're saying and I'm sorry.
And beyond that, here's what I'm going to do to rectify it or to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Because it's one thing to take ownership, right? But what if the pattern persists? What if there's no change?
Right. So it's important with the important thing with this one is accountability. And accountability is something that can happen through therapy, because people build themselves up frequently they've spent so much time and that blaming others for their lot in life, that they've never actually looked at themselves in the mirror.
Yes. And sometimes they're going to be more honest with a therapist as opposed to being honest with you. So that could be the starting point of being accountable.
Exactly.
Well, listeners, we're going to have to leave it there because we're going to come back next week with part 2 because we have a lot to cover on this particular topic. So until next week, go out and have a great week.